I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. One of my 2023 goals was actually to work from home more often, which so far so good. We're about a month in at the time of recording this podcast, and I've actually done a decent job. But interestingly, what it's meant is there's often dogs in the background of my podcast recordings, and although I've done my best to try and edit them out in other recording opportunities, just realizing it's a little bit of a losing battle when you have two dogs that only want to be in the room that you're in and only want to be play fighting with each other, seemingly while you're recording, which I feel like that's what happens with kids when you're on the phone, right? They wait until you're on the phone and then they fight. My dogs do the same thing. So if you end up hearing some collars shaking or whatnot in the background, I did my best. But in the spirit of imperfect action, we're going to forge forward with this podcast recording despite me having two dogs wrestling beside me. I was inspired by today's conversation by conversations that I'm watching happen in other spaces. I do belong to a few membership and subscriptions that are geared towards higher level research and science in the nutrition space, and have watched this conversation unfolding around where responsibility lies with respect to health change. And it's interesting because the people that I respect, that I adore their work, that, you know, often start out in that very patient-facing perspective, eventually the conversation has to, when we're talking health, shift to a conversation about politics. And it's funny because, on social media, you'll often hear comments or people saying, stick to what you know, stick to nutrition, stick to naturopathic medicine. When really the separation of those two things is almost impossible. And the more you learn and the more you know about nutrition, about health, the less you're able to separate the effect that policy has on health. And the conversation that was happening in the group that I'm involved in is basically, where does responsibility lie / where do we seemingly put the most effort? Is it from this bottom-up approach, meaning that the individual is the one who is responsible for their own health and responsible for change, versus is it a top-down approach where policy, the government, access to resources becomes the solution? And the more you learn and know about health, the more you understand how deep the inequity is around access to healthcare, nutrition, food. And essentially, it boils down to, like, if you want to be healthy, well, just live in a high resource nation and have, a relatively decent disposable income. And I think we all probably want for more than that, if you're rich, you get to be healthy, but if you're not, you're shit out of luck, which is why it's hard for people in the health space to turn away from policy, because so much of the challenges we face in health and healthcare directly stem down from the way that we approach some of these systemic issues. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert at that. I haven't deeply studied health policy in a long time. And I would say if you're interested in that, there's lots of people in areas where you can start to expose yourself to some of those concepts or information. But I wanted to take that theme and talk about it with respect to your health, because I do believe there's a difference between that top-down approach versus bottom-up approach with respect to trying to help you meet your health goals. So when we're talking about it with respect to public health, bottom up looks like the individual's responsible, right? The individual's responsible in that moment. They have to make good, healthy choices, and we're going to educate them about what they need to eat to prevent diabetes. And we need the individual to go for a walk, and we need the individual to be responsible for going for their lab work on time. These are the things from a health policy perspective that place emphasis and responsibility on the individual, whereas that top-down approach is looking at the environment, right? So yeah, we want you to go to the lab. Like, do you live within 100 kilometers of a lab? Our clinic has a relationship with the First Nations in Ontario, and we have some patients that it is like a commute to get to the lab, like ferry ride, like all of the things. And in order for us to get a fasting blood work done on that population, what are we asking them to do? Like stay over in a hotel so that they can stay closer to a lab and then show up on time for a fasting blood work that is normally an hour ferry ride away, right? Like, remembering when we have that bottom up approach, we're basically asking for obstacles getting in the way for success. So when I say that top down approach, and sometimes I would say patients don't even really realize what is getting in the way, like systemically, of them achieving their goals. But top down would look like, do you live near the resources that you actually need to be healthy? Is it possible to access the food, the clean water, the healthcare services that are necessary for you to meet your health goals, or even just prevent, basic disease, right? Those are some top-down things. Like, organizationally, is your life have the possibility for you to access health, or are there these systemic barriers that are getting in your way? And again, you might not have even thought about it because so many of these things are normalized, right? If I have patients that have really substantial hair loss, and I live and work in the GTA, or I work in the GTA, I live outside in the country and commute into the GTA. But even when I start to talk about things like hair loss, I start to refer to clinics and centers that are in major cities like Toronto, right? Like, if you really wanted to get that treated, you're going to have to go to Toronto. And I live close to Toronto, and yet we'll refer to that that's like the epicenter of specialized healthcare, is that you're going to commute to go get it. But I, again, live in the GTA, right? There are lots of rural communities, Ontario and well beyond, of course, that don't have access to specialized health centers. And we've normalized that, right? We're like, if you really want something good, you're going to drive into the city to get it. But for some people, their basic health needs is that they have to do that as well for their basic health needs. And so that's looking at things from that sort of top-down approach. And like I said, we've normalized so much of that, you may not even be able to see where that is in your life, right? Maybe you can only access certain foods or food groups, or at various times of the year, there's going to be things that are not available to you because of where you live. Perhaps based on your work, right? There is this systemic challenge because of your work or workplace, or the hours that are required, or on call that's required, that then gets in the way of you achieving your health goals or being able to access your health care in a particular way. But again, we have to normalize these pieces. And so you have to really dig deep to think about it. Even perhaps maybe your culture, there is a barrier to accessing some of the foods that would make your diet more well-rounded within your particular culture. And so you rely on maybe North American diet fillers, very common for by the time we get to a second generation of a particular immigrant family, that they've started to incorporate many, many North American foods into their lifestyle, which usually to their health detriment. And it's questionable why that is, right? Is it the convenience factor? Is it that it's cheaper? Or it's maybe some of the foods that would be part of their cultural diet are actually not available based on where they live. So they start to supplement it with the foods that are available. And then that ends up being a less healthy version of nutrition for themselves. The Indian vegetarian diet can be a beautiful diet, but if where you live, vegetarianism looks like a grilled cheese, based on what you can access and what you can afford, that's really not going to meet your health goals. And part of that is your inability to meet your cultural needs. But today's episode isn't really about policy, but I want to show that dichotomy of that bottom-up versus top-down approach to health solutions, because we're going to talk about it in the micro of your life, right? The macro being at a population level, looking at public health, looking at the health of our communities, and looking at all of our health at the same time. But I want to look at it in the micro of your life, because what I was reflecting on when I was listening to this conversation happen from a policy and public health perspective is that even within the individual's life, we often have these same bottom-up approaches to your health rather than, I'm going to say top down, but what I mean is like inside your house, right? So if we took the actual full environment just being your house, your family unit, your life, that would be sort of that top-down approach to your health strategy, whereas bottom-up is, again, still relying just on you as the individual in order to make things happen. It really got me thinking about this and how so many of the solutions that we're offering patients or talking to patients about are bottom-up, as if they don't have control over the quote-unquote policies that they're household is run by, right? Like this is we're going to talk about like radical responsibility for the policies that exist within your household that are influencing your ability to either get healthy or stay where you are. So if I was going to give you some bottom-up examples of what things look like, right? We're often offering solutions to patients that might sound something like this. Don't eat what the rest of your family is eating or what's in your cupboard, right? If you think about, like, if one person in the house has a particular health goal and they have teenagers or they have a partner and their partner doesn't give a shit about what they eat, we will say to that one person, that individual, just don't have the pasta, or put those chips up in a high cupboard and then only get out one bowl, or don't participate in what your family's eating at all, right? This is the solution, bottom up. We say to the one person, you're going to will your way through this, right? It's your responsibility to resist the food that is in your environment. Another example might look like trying to find time for exercise after everyone else's needs are met in your house. So your kids have gone to their sports, right? Maybe your partner has even gone to their sports. Your work is done, the dishwasher is emptied. And after all of that, bottom up, we say, oh, I'm supposed to go get on my Peloton. Right? Trying to find time to exercise after everything else is done in the pot, like all the other things are off the plate, and then trying to find time to exercise. That is a bottom-up approach to trying to improve your health. I also find it really interesting that we've basically degraded me time down to like trying to find 5 minutes to yourself. Like I don't know about you, but I am not recharged after 5 minutes of time to myself. Like 5 minutes of me time, like it might as well have not even happened, to be honest. And yet in the, world of hashtag self-care, this is what we're talking to people about, like trying to find 5 minutes of time to themselves. And that's, again, a bottom-up approach where we're saying it's your responsibility to find time for yourself amidst this absolute chaos and the absolute expectation that you are all things to all people in your microenvironment and maybe even outside of your house as well. So what we're going to think about here from our top-down approach is that, let's remember that you are the president or prime minister or the queen of your household. And maybe you're the co-president of your household, But let's remember that inside the environment of our house, we probably have more control over policy than we are giving credit to, and then we are taking control of. So that bottom up approach of like, I'm going to do my best not to eat these salt and vinegar chips. Like if salt and vinegar chips are not on your plan, and that's a whole different conversation, whether they are or aren't, then how come they are in the environment? Right? How come they're there? How come you with a health goals needs come below the people who like salt and vinegar chips? Right? Why don't you get to live in a space that is free from the things that get in the way of you achieving your goal when you are the queen of the house? And it's like I said, we're going to take radical responsibility here. And really, it is a brave choice to change policy inside your living arrangement and inside your house. It is a brave decision to construct policy in your house that is actually meeting your goals. Especially if the long-standing norm has been that you are going to bottom up, try and white knuckle your way through your goals despite the environment, right? But remember when I made it about public health and I said, oh yeah, that patient of mine has to drive and ferry ride and whatnot to the lab, you immediately were like, well, that's not fair. How on earth is that woman supposed to achieve her goals when that is what she has to overcome in order to make it happen? And yet, the moment that I'm like, yeah, your teenagers can't have that shit in the house if that's not your goal. You're like, but I should be able to overcome it. I should be able to just not eat it. They should be allowed to have whatever food they want. Right? Suddenly, when I made it about you and your household and their chips, you stop seeing it in the same way. And yet, in my opinion, it is 100% the same. How is it possible that you have to live in that environment and try and succeed when we can easily back up and look at the macro and say that's not fair, that other people need to try and succeed when the environment's out to get them? Right? I want you to really think about that, because that top-down approach would at the very least look like, if they're going to eat chips, that you have something else that you like, and who cares if it's a little bit more expensive than chips, right? That it's something that actually helps you in your environment reach your goals, rather than that bottom-up approach that requires you, the individual, to bear 100% of the responsibility of making it happen for yourself despite the environment. And I pick on the nutrition piece here where I think I'm going to expand it out and we'll talk about a couple of other examples. But like the research shows that if the chips are there, you eat the chips. 100%. If the chips are there, you eat the chips. So it has nothing to do with you, your willpower, your goals, how you feel about yourself. Like this is something that you are not capable of overcoming in the long haul. Maybe you can avoid them once, but the general research consensus is when hyperpalatable foods are available in the environment, the people eat them. Right? Which again, if we talk about policy and nutrition from a big, broader scale, having hyperpalatable foods available means we all eat them. They're also the cheapest and most accessible foods. So you can see the bigger issue. But within the micro of your house, you cannot, in the long term, succeed when the environment is set up for failure. You just can't. And yet we're so used to making it about you that we say, even in our health plans, we'll be like, well, when your family's eating this, like you have butternut squash instead. It's not possible, actually, in the long haul. It's not possible without policy change. There needs to be policy change in your house that actually supports and meets your health goals. That doesn't mean that your teenagers can never have salt and vinegar chips. It means that the general operations of your house has to include you as part of the success plan. It has to include your health goals, which maybe means that other people need to sacrifice a little bit or compromise a little bit. But at the policy level in your household, it is impossible for you to be the sole bearer of responsibility of saying no thank you to the chips. I can also use the example of the exercise, right? Like, it cannot be your sole responsibility to find time to exercise when all the other needs of your household have been met first. It just can't. Look, over the long haul, that is impossible for that to be a successful plan if the infrastructure of your family's life says, as a policy, like, imagine having to write this out. As a policy, mom exercises after everybody else's needs are met. Right? Like, think about that on a bigger scale. We could never get away with that being a policy anywhere. Think of all the people that would be marginalized and harmed by a policy said that you matter after everybody else is done mattering. We would never. And yet, that's the policy in your house. The policy in your household is, I matter when you're all done mattering. And that is setting you up for failure. So if week over week, you're like, ooh, I didn't get to my exercise again. I was too tired to do my exercise. That's a huge one that I'll see with patients. At the end of the day, I was too tired to do my exercise. Okay, at a policy level, we need to change things so that exercise becomes higher up on the priority list. Systemically in your house, someone else has to unload the dishwasher after dinner so that you can go for a walk. At a policy level, there needs to be a change. Because if you do all the things and at the end of it, we base our success on your willpower and level of fatigue, we never win. At a policy level, we need to change what's possible for you during the day if we want it to happen. Same with the me time piece. And this doesn't have to be, I don't know why this came to mind, but we find like scheduled sex really unsexy. And yet, I think there's a decent amount of conversation and research around scheduling sex means people actually have it, right? I think there is something around scheduled me time that we feel yucky about, whether it's, again, guilt or, we just have hope that it will magically happen for us. And yet, if it doesn't exist at a policy level in your household that you have time for yourself, it will be 5 minutes, and it will be you trying to scrape together those 5 minutes without little fingers coming under the door and asking you where their hockey helmet is. And so again, at a policy level, can we step back and look at the big micro of your household and find the pockets of your week that are you? Because if you can't, right, that bottom-up approach of you trying to scrape together 5 minutes to yourself is never going to work. It has to start from the top. It has to start from the infrastructure of your family unit, of your household, that prioritizes the things that are a priority. My husband and I are talking about, we're looking at a hobby farm. And we were talking the other night about what a brave choice it would be to actually do it and how difficult it is for us to put what we just want as the center of decision making and how easy it is. And then we spiraled into a conversation about like, well, why is that? Why is that we have such a hard time putting what we want as the forefront of the conversation and then building infrastructure around that so that you can just achieve it? And I think with health, it's the same. If you say that your health is a value, where is it in the policy of your house? Do you have policies? So we don't have a lot of policies that we have to like outright say right now in our household because a lot of the things that we've worked so hard, like that, my exercise is in my calendar. It's non-negotiable. I'll miss something and go to the gym. Like I'll miss stuff because that's a policy that just has to be happening. But we've had to evolve them over time. We're in the middle of ski season and man, is it ever convenient to just buy your lunch when you're skiing, right? However, we had to come up with a policy as a family that we would only buy our lunch 1 day per week. No matter how many days of the week we managed to get to the ski hill, only 1 day could be a purchased lunch. because you could see how easy it would be to go down this spiral of buying our lunch when it was convenient, when we woke up too late, when we didn't really have the right groceries, when nobody felt like making anything, when we really craved those chicken fingers because they're really good. If we let the decision be bottom up, well, let's see how we feel. Let's see how the morning goes. Let's see what's left over, right? If we made it that bottom up approach, we'd buy our lunch every single time we went. But instead, we had to top down, be like, okay, policy, we only buy it once a week. And guess what happens? Your grocery shop changes because now you're like, ooh, we ski twice this week. We need extra food for packed lunches, right? When you make it a policy, infrastructure starts to fall in beneath it to actually be able to support it. And so, but that decision can't be bottom up. It can't be on a Saturday morning when we all slept in and we roll out of bed and we're a little bit late and the laundry for the ski stuff wasn't quite dry. And then you ask yourself the question, are we going to bring lunch or buy lunch? That's too late. And I know that's one silly little example, but hopefully you can see that in yourself or in your week, that if that's not a policy, and we had to say it as a team of 4 of us, be like, guys, we are buying lunch once, right? Which day do you want it to be? And invariably, my family always picks the next day, right? The whenever one is coming up closer. It's like we want to delay the pain of making the lunch by one more day. But we had to do it as a family unit. What do we want this to look like? 1 time per week, we're going to eat out. And there's probably some examples of that where you can see these barriers that are getting in the way of you achieving your health goal. Maybe it's restaurant meals, right? Maybe it's, the how often you grocery shop or where you get your groceries from. Maybe it's this idea that you're supposed to eat healthy and everyone else can eat whatever they want, right? That requires policy change because we're asking you to be the sole bearer of the responsibility. Where if you sat in that queen role just for 5 minutes and thought about your kingdom, you included, of what the needs were of the group of individuals that live within that community, you included, your decision would be different, right? At a policy level in your house, your decision as the queen would be different. And that would trickle down to you as the user. But instead, rather than sitting in that leadership role in our house, we just kind of get what we get, right? It's like everybody else's needs really matter, and I will really try to have spaghetti squash while you guys eat spaghetti. And it doesn't work in the long haul. And I thought this was such an interesting conversation, or just a unique way of looking at health change, is that what would happen if for a second you got out of the trenches of your day-to-day and you sat in that policy maker's position? What policies would you put in place in your house that were equitable, that meant that everyone's voices were heard? It meant the greater good for the greater amount of people, right? That's how we make policy, or that's how we should make policy. And when we see these systemic issues in healthcare and in the consumption of health at a policy level, we actually can see reflections of it in your house. You can't access everything you need to access. You have barriers in your day-to-day function in your own household that we've just expected you to white knuckle your way through with willpower. It doesn't work. We know that. So sit in the policymaker's role just for a week and think about all the happenings inside your house and whether or not they're actually meeting the needs of all the citizens that live there, you included, and whether or not you need to make a policy change and not an individual health change. I'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.